Patricia Reynolds had been a volunteer coordinator at St. Catherine's Medical Center for 14 years. When she made a decision that would destroy her reputation and cost the hospital $3 million, she was 58 years old, experienced enough to recognize a physician's parking permit, but apparently convinced that black men couldn't be surgeons at prestigious hospitals. One Monday morning in the physician parking lot, she saw a black man in scrubs approaching a Mercedes sedan with a physician parking tag and assumed he was stealing it. What Reynolds did next, blocking his car with her body, calling security despite his hospital ID, and insisting he was lying when he showed his surgical credentials, would become proof of how racial bias operates in professional spaces, and how institutions protect patterns of discrimination until someone fights back. A black man in his early 40s, Dr. Marcus Bennett, was walking toward his car in the physician parking lot at St. Catherine's Medical Center at 6:45 a.m. on a Monday morning. His surgical scrubs were visible under his jacket. His hospital ID badge hung from his neck. His keys were in his hand. No crime, no violation, no disturbance. Just a surgeon heading to his car before a scheduled procedure. But Patricia Reynolds saw him through a filter so distorted by assumptions about who belongs in physician parking that she couldn't process a black man as a legitimate doctor. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. St. Catherine's Medical Center sits on Medical Plaza Drive in the affluent Preston Heights neighborhood of Atlanta. It's a Level 1 trauma center known for its cardiac surgery program, a gleaming complex of connected buildings with fountains, manicured lawns, and separate parking structures for physicians, staff, and visitors. The physician lot is closest to the main entrance, protected by a card reader gate and clearly marked with signs that read, "Physician parking only. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed." It was 6:45 a.m. on a Monday in October. The air was cool and crisp. The parking lot was about half full, physicians arriving for early morning rounds and surgeries scheduled throughout the day. Security cameras covered every angle. LED lights illuminated the painted lines and the walking paths, the kind of morning where nothing dramatic typically happens. Just doctors arriving for another day of saving lives. Dr. Marcus Anthony Bennett had been a cardiothoracic surgeon at St. Catherine's Medical Center for 11 years. 11 years performing open-heart surgeries, valve replacements, coronary artery bypass procedures, and emergency interventions that required steady hands and split-second decisions. He'd completed over 1,400 successful surgeries with one of the lowest complication rates in the Southeast. He'd trained residents, published research in peer-reviewed journals, and developed a minimally invasive technique for mitral valve repair that reduced recovery time by 40%. The hospital's marketing materials featured his work. His patient satisfaction scores were consistently in the 99th percentile. His colleagues called him brilliant. His patients called him the surgeon who gave them their lives back. Bennett had graduated from Morehouse College with honors, then completed medical school at Emory University School of Medicine, where he'd been inducted into the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society. He'd done his general surgery residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most competitive programs in the country, followed by a cardiothoracic surgery fellowship at Johns Hopkins. He'd received the American College of Surgeons Young Surgeon Award. He'd been a keynote speaker at national cardiology conferences. At 42 years old, Marcus Bennett was exactly where he'd worked to be: respected, accomplished, and trusted with the most complex cases. He'd sacrificed relationships, sleep, and decades of relentless work to earn the title of surgeon. He drove a black Mercedes E-Class sedan, not flashy but professional, purchased after his first full year as an attending physician. He lived in a modest home, 15 minutes from the hospital, so he could respond quickly to emergencies. He had 2 daughters, ages 9 and 12, who knew their father saved lives, but didn't always understand why he missed so many dinners. That Monday morning, Bennett had a 7:30 a.m. surgery scheduled, a triple coronary artery bypass on a 61-year-old patient with severe blockages. He'd arrived at the hospital at 6:30 a.m., parked in his assigned spot in the physician lot, and gone inside to review the patient's preoperative labs and imaging. Everything looked good. The anesthesiology team was ready. The OR was prepped. He'd walked back to his car at 6:42 a.m. to grab his personal iPad, which had surgical reference materials he liked to review before complex cases. He wore navy blue surgical scrubs under a gray quarter-zip pullover jacket. His hospital ID badge, clearly displaying his photo, name, title, and department, hung from a lanyard around his neck. Dr. Marcus Bennett, MD, fax, cardiothoracic surgery. His car keys were in his right hand, his phone was in his pocket. He looked like what he was, a surgeon preparing for a morning procedure. He'd done nothing to attract attention. He'd spoken to no one in the parking lot. He'd violated nothing. But to one person in that parking lot, Dr. Marcus Bennett's presence was a problem, and that person had decided to do something about it. Patricia Reynolds was 58 years old. She'd been the volunteer coordinator at St. Catherine's Medical Center for 14 years, managing the schedules and assignments of nearly 200 volunteers, who staffed the gift shop, helped patients navigate the facility, and provided administrative support. She'd been hired straight out of a community college program in nonprofit management and had built her entire career around St. Catherine's. She was enthusiastic about the hospital's reputation, proud of its rankings, and deeply committed to maintaining what she called the institution's professional image. Her supervisors described her as organized but sometimes overly concerned with appearances and protocols. She'd received positive performance reviews, but also notes about being inflexible and occasionally dismissive of staff who didn't match her expectations of what healthcare professionals should look like. In 14 years, Patricia Reynolds had developed a pattern. She'd filed 3 formal complaints about staff members who she felt didn't represent the hospital appropriately. A young Latina nurse who wore hoop earrings that Reynolds claimed were unprofessional. Complaint dismissed after the nurse showed hospital dress code allowed all earrings. A black male phlebotomist who drove what Reynolds described as an expensive car, inappropriate for his salary level. Complaint dismissed as irrelevant to job performance. An Asian administrative assistant who spoke Mandarin on the phone during breaks, which Reynolds claimed made other staff uncomfortable. Complaint dismissed after HR explained multilingual communication was not a violation. Each complaint revealed the same underlying issue. Reynolds made assumptions about who belonged in certain roles based on their appearance, race, and behavior that deviated from her narrow expectations. Each complaint was dismissed, but no corrective action was taken against Reynolds. No pattern analysis was conducted. No conversations about implicit bias occurred. The complaints were filed away, and Reynolds continued volunteering with full access to hospital facilities. That Monday morning, Reynolds had arrived early for a volunteer orientation session scheduled for 8 a.m. She'd parked in the volunteer lot adjacent to the physician parking area and was walking toward the main entrance when she saw something that triggered her suspicions. A black man in casual clothing, what looked like gym clothes to her, walking toward a Mercedes sedan in physician parking. In Reynolds' mind, that didn't make sense. Black men didn't drive expensive cars in physician parking. They must be maintenance staff, security guards, maybe cafeteria workers. This man had to be up to something. She didn't notice the scrubs under his jacket. She didn't see the hospital ID badge. She didn't consider that he might belong there. She just saw a black man near an expensive car and assumed theft. She changed direction, walking quickly toward the physician lot. Her heart rate increased. She felt a surge of protective righteousness. Someone had to stop this. Someone had to protect hospital property. She was going to be that someone. Reynolds approached as Bennett reached his car and pressed the key fob to unlock it. The lights flashed. The locks clicked. Do you think hospital volunteers should face consequences for racially profiling physicians? Drop your answer below. Step away from that vehicle. Bennett turned, confused by the sharp voice behind him. He saw a white woman in her 50s, wearing a St. Catherine's volunteer badge and a determined expression. I'm sorry, what? This is a doctor's car. You don't work here. Bennett blinked, processing what was happening. He'd experienced versions of this before, assumptions that he couldn't be a physician, questions about whether he was really qualified, but never in the parking lot of his own hospital. Actually, I do work here. I'm Dr. Bennett. This is my car. Reynolds stepped closer, positioning herself between Bennett and the driver's side door. The hospital doesn't hire people like you to be doctors. You're stealing this car. People like you. The words hung in the air. Bennett felt the familiar combination of anger and exhaustion that came with being questioned about his credentials based on his skin color. People like me? I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I've worked here for 11 years. This is my assigned parking space. He gestured to the sign on the concrete wall. Space 47. Dr. M. Bennett. Reynolds glanced at the sign, but her expression didn't change. Anyone could park in a space. That didn't prove ownership. I'm calling security right now. Don't you dare touch that car. Bennett pulled his hospital ID badge forward, holding it up where Reynolds could see it clearly. The badge displayed his photo, his name, his credentials, and his department in bold letters. Ma'am, I have surgery in 20 minutes. These are my keys. This is my hospital ID. Check it if you want. Reynolds pulled out her phone, but barely looked at the ID. I know what you're trying to do, and it won't work. Security is on their way. This is where assumptions become accusations. Patricia Reynolds had seen a black man near a Mercedes and constructed a narrative: theft, deception, danger. When Bennett showed her his hospital ID, she didn't reconsider her assumptions. She doubled down. The ID must be fake. The explanation must be a lie. Her bias was so complete that physical evidence contradicting it was simply dismissed as part of the deception. The parking lot wasn't empty. 2 other physicians were walking toward their cars about 30 feet away. A nurse was getting out of her vehicle in the adjacent row. All 3 stopped, watching the confrontation unfold. Bennett tried one more time. Ma'am, I'm Dr. Marcus Bennett. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I have a surgery scheduled right now. You can verify everything I'm saying with one phone call to the surgical department. Reynolds had her phone to her ear. Yes, security? I'm in the physician parking lot. There's a man trying to steal a car. He's claiming to be a doctor. But I know he's lying. He has what looks like a fake ID badge. Yes, I'll stay here. Please hurry. She ended the call and looked at Bennett with satisfaction. They're on their way. You can explain yourself to them. Bennett felt the seconds ticking away. His patient was being prepped for surgery. The OR team was waiting. He had responsibilities that didn't pause for someone's racist delusions. You're making a serious mistake. I'm going to document this entire incident, and I'm going to make sure the hospital understands exactly what happened here. Reynolds crossed her arms. Good. You should be prosecuted for impersonating a doctor and attempting vehicle theft. One of the physicians who'd been watching approached. Dr. Sarah Kim, an oncologist who'd worked with Bennett on several multidisciplinary cases. Patricia, what are you doing? That's Dr. Bennett. He's head of our cardiothoracic surgery program. Reynolds turned to her, flustered. How do you know that's really him? Dr. Kim stared at her in disbelief. Because I've worked with him for 6 years. Patricia, you need to step away from his car right now. Reynolds hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face for the first time. A hospital security vehicle pulled into the lot, lights flashing. 2 security officers got out and approached. Ma'am, you called about a vehicle theft? Reynolds pointed at Bennett. Yes. This man was trying to break into this Mercedes. He claims he's a doctor, but I don't believe him. The lead security officer, James Morrison, had been with St. Catherine's for 9 years. He knew Dr. Bennett. They'd spoken dozens of times when Bennett arrived late at night for emergency surgeries. Dr. Bennett? Is everything okay? Bennett exhaled, relief and frustration mixing together. James, thank you. This woman blocked me from my car, called me a thief, and claimed I'm impersonating a physician. I showed her my hospital ID. I told her I have surgery scheduled. She called you anyway. Morrison turned to Reynolds, his expression hardening. Ma'am, that is Dr. Marcus Bennett. He's one of our cardiothoracic surgeons. This is his car. He parks here every day. Reynolds' face went pale. But he didn't look like... I thought... Morrison cut her off. You thought a black man couldn't be a surgeon? Reynolds stammered, searching for words that wouldn't make it worse. She found none. I was trying to protect hospital property. I made a mistake. The other security officer spoke up. Ma'am, we're going to need your volunteer badge. My badge? Why? because you just racially profiled a physician and falsely accused him of a crime. You're being removed from hospital property pending an investigation. Bennett checked his watch. 6:58 a.m. He was going to be late. James, I need to go. I have a patient waiting, but I want a full incident report, security footage from the parking lot, and the recording of her call to your office. Morrison nodded. Already documenting everything, Dr. Bennett. I'm sorry this happened. Bennett got into his car, started the engine, and drove toward the hospital entrance. In his rearview mirror, he saw Morrison confiscating Reynolds' volunteer badge as Dr. Kim stood nearby, shaking her head. Should hospitals face financial penalties for failing to address patterns of racial bias among staff and volunteers? Let me know what you think. Within hours, the security footage had been reviewed by hospital administration. The recording of Reynolds' call to security was transcribed. Dr. Kim and the other witnesses submitted statements. The nursing supervisor overheard Reynolds insist that Bennett couldn't be a doctor because the hospital doesn't hire people like that. The hospital's vice president of human resources, Angela Torres, called an emergency meeting with the chief medical officer, the hospital's legal counsel, and the director of security. They reviewed the evidence and reached an immediate conclusion. Patricia Reynolds needed to be permanently banned from hospital property, and Dr. Bennett needed to be contacted before he filed a lawsuit. Dr. Bennett completed his surgery successfully. The triple bypass went flawlessly. His patient was stable in the ICU by 10:15 a.m. Bennett removed his surgical mask, scrubbed out, and checked his phone. 7 missed calls from hospital administration. 12 text messages from colleagues expressing support and outrage. He returned the call to Angela Torres. Dr. Bennett, thank you for calling me back. I want to apologize on behalf of St. Catherine's Medical Center for what happened this morning. What Patricia Reynolds did was inexcusable, and we've already taken action. Bennett listened as Torres explained. Reynolds had been terminated from her volunteer position effective immediately, banned from all hospital property, and reported to the volunteer organization's national registry. The hospital was conducting a comprehensive review of all her previous complaints to identify any other instances of discriminatory behavior. But Bennett knew an apology wasn't enough. Angela, I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about Patricia Reynolds. She filed 3 complaints in 14 years, all targeting staff members of color. Someone reviewed those complaints. Someone dismissed them. Someone decided there wasn't a pattern. And this morning, she felt comfortable enough to block my car, call me a thief, and insist I couldn't possibly be a doctor because of my race. That comfort came from somewhere. Torres was silent for a moment. You're absolutely right. We failed to connect the dots, and that failure created an environment where this felt acceptable to her. Bennett continued, I need to think about my next steps, but I want you to understand that I'm not the first black physician to experience this here, and I won't be the last unless something systemic changes. Torres assured him the hospital was committed to change. Bennett thanked her for the call and hung up. Then he contacted an attorney who specialized in civil rights and employment discrimination. Should medical professionals face automatic disciplinary review after racially profiling incidents? Drop your answer. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later. It named Patricia Reynolds, the volunteer services director, who had reviewed her prior complaints without action, the vice president of human resources for failure to identify patterns of discrimination, and St. Catherine's Medical Center for creating and maintaining a hostile work environment that tolerated racial bias. The claims were detailed and devastating. Racial discrimination and harassment under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, creation and maintenance of a hostile work environment, negligent retention of a volunteer with documented pattern of racial bias, violation of Georgia Fair Employment Practices Act, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation through false accusations of theft and impersonation. St. Catherine's legal team reviewed the evidence. Security footage showing Reynolds blocking Bennett's car, audio recording of her 911 call insisting he was lying about being a doctor, witness statements from Dr. Kim and other physicians, documentation of Reynolds' 3 prior complaints all targeting people of color, and Bennett's spotless 11-year record at the hospital. They also reviewed Bennett's credentials: Morehouse College Honors graduate, Emory Medical School, Massachusetts General Hospital residency, Johns Hopkins fellowship, over 2,400 successful surgeries, published researcher, award-winning physician. A man who had dedicated his life to medicine and healing, treated like a criminal in the parking lot of his own hospital. The hospital's insurance carrier ran the numbers. A jury trial would be catastrophic. A prominent black surgeon, impeccable credentials, racially profiled by a white volunteer, with a documented history of bias that the hospital ignored. Every major news outlet would cover it. The damage to the hospital's reputation would be immense. Recruitment of diverse physicians would suffer. Patients would question whether the hospital valued all its doctors equally. The hospital settled 11 months after the incident. St. Catherine's Medical Center paid Dr. Marcus Bennett $3 million. Patricia Reynolds was personally liable for $50,000, though her bankruptcy filing meant Bennett would likely never collect it. The settlement agreement included additional terms: mandatory implicit bias training for all staff, volunteers, and physicians, creation of an independent diversity and inclusion board with authority to investigate complaints, quarterly demographic analysis of all internal complaints to identify patterns, removal of volunteer screening authority from the Volunteer Services Director, direct reporting line from the Chief Diversity Officer to the hospital, CEO public acknowledgement that Dr. Bennett was wrongfully accused and racially profiled. Patricia Reynolds released a brief statement through her attorney. I made assumptions based on Dr. Bennett's race that I deeply regret. My actions were wrong, and I accept responsibility for the harm I caused. But apologies don't erase the trauma of being treated like a criminal for being black in a parking lot. Should medical institutions face automatic federal investigations after substantiated racial profiling incidents? Drop your answer. Dr. Marcus Bennett testified at a medical ethics conference 9 months after the settlement. His testimony was measured, powerful, and impossible to ignore. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I've completed 11 years of education and training after college. I've performed over 1,400 open-heart surgeries. I hold a faculty position at a major medical center. I've published research. I've trained residents. I've saved lives. He paused. And I was accused of stealing my own car in the parking lot of my hospital because a volunteer coordinator couldn't imagine that a black man in scrubs could be a surgeon. She saw me approaching a Mercedes, and her immediate assumption was theft. Not that I might work there. Not that I might belong there. Theft. Another pause. She didn't check my hospital ID before calling security. She didn't ask for verification. She decided what I was based on my race. And every piece of evidence after that, my credentials, my explanation, my keys, was filtered through that assumption. A colleague had to intervene. Security had to confirm my identity. And even then, she struggled to accept that she'd made a mistake. His voice carried the weight of experience. St. Catherine's paid me $3 million. That's significant compensation. But money doesn't change the fact that I was made to feel like a criminal in my own workplace. It doesn't erase the message that even 11 years of exemplary service, even a wall full of credentials, even lives saved, isn't enough to overcome someone's racial bias. He looked directly at the audience of physicians, administrators, and healthcare professionals. This happens to black physicians every day. We're mistaken for janitors, questioned about our qualifications, assumed to be less competent. If this can happen to a cardiothoracic surgeon, with my credentials in the parking lot of my own hospital, what's happening to black residents, black nurses, black medical students, black patients? What message are we sending about who belongs in medicine? The room was completely silent. Should hospitals implement automatic consequences for staff who racially profile physicians and patients? Drop your answer below. This wasn't just about Patricia Reynolds or one volunteer coordinator or one hospital parking lot. This was about a healthcare system that still operates on assumptions about who looks like a doctor, who belongs in leadership, who deserves respect. Reynolds' bias was individual, but the system that ignored her pattern of discriminatory complaints, that's institutional. That's all of us. When institutions fail to address patterns of racial bias, when they dismiss complaints involving staff members of color, when they treat each incident in isolation instead of recognizing systemic problems, They create environments where racial profiling feels acceptable, even righteous. Patricia Reynolds felt comfortable blocking Dr. Bennett's car because somewhere along the way, her biases had been validated by a system that never held her accountable. 3 complaints in 14 years. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. A pattern your hospital ignored until it targeted someone with resources to fight back. Change requires more than settlements. It requires institutions to recognize patterns, confront bias, and create consequences for discrimination. It requires healthcare professionals to examine our own assumptions about who belongs in medicine. And it requires us to stop treating racism as isolated incidents and start addressing it as the systemic problem it is. Patricia Reynolds' career as a volunteer is over. That's consequence. The hospital paid $3 million. That's accountability. But money and terminations don't undo the trauma of being arrested for drinking coffee. They don't restore the dignity of being handcuffed in front of dozens of strangers. They don't erase the message that even an FBI badge isn't enough to protect you from bias. The real question is, what changes now? Do hospitals finally track patterns in volunteer and staff complaints instead of reviewing them in isolation? Do institutions finally implement real consequences for racial bias instead of dismissing it as misunderstandings? Do we finally acknowledge that credentials, education, and expertise aren't protection against racism in professional spaces? Because if we don't fix the systems that allowed Patricia Reynolds to file 3 discriminatory complaints over 14 years without consequence, if we don't address the culture that makes Black physicians prove their legitimacy every day, then we're just waiting for the next parking lot, the next volunteer, the next surgeon who has to defend their right to exist in their own workplace. Comment if you believe this should be law. Healthcare institutions that fail to address documented patterns of racial bias face mandatory federal civil rights investigations and financial penalties. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with awareness and change starts with pressure, then hit that subscribe button. We're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing these patterns, demanding better, and fighting for the surgeons, the physicians, the healthcare professionals who deserve to work without being profiled, questioned, or made to prove they belong. This isn't just about one volunteer coordinator or one surgeon. It's about all of us and the healthcare system we're willing to accept.